because I don't want, you know, drive-throughs, though, for the simple reason that we know what happens on Route 1 in Scarborough. At certain times of the day, though, that the cars will, queue right up into the, right-hand lane, and that's the last thing we want in the middle of downtown Saco. So that's the main reason I'm against drive-throughs, not the practice of it. It's just because how people behave when they want the coffee and they don't care that they're in the middle of traffic. So.
Okay, great, thank you. I think that gives us what we need for that item. Is there a specific item we should discuss now?
I have one, and has to do with 179.5-04, the urban green space, which you are removing for further consideration, which I have no problem with. But I would like to just toss out a notion in considering that very topic, that we stop for a moment and take a look at our dimensional standards. We're trying to encourage increased density development, which I have no problem with. In part and parcel to that is the influx of 8-unit buildings. And I would like to have you give some consideration to modifying the setback requirements, side yard and rear yard, for 8-unit buildings. And the standard that I've been tossing around in my head is an incremental change in the setback. So if you're going to build a 1 or 2-unit building, retain the existing setbacks, but as you add additional units to the building, you add additional setback requirements, say 5 feet per unit. And because my fear is that in encouraging these 8-unit structures, if we don't provide better setbacks, we're gonna scoff up all of the green space, and these poor people who are living in these buildings are going to literally be on top of each other with no backyards or side yards to, spread out and let the kids play. So I don't know if, and you would know better than I, but as you're thinking about this, if there are other standards that we can find in other municipalities to deal with that issue. I mean, our comp plan is pretty clear about maintaining green space, and for us to encourage that kind of building and development is a good thing in terms of housing, but it's counterproductive on the green space side. So I'm not disputing the need to take it out of the mix like you're doing. It's fine, but I would just ask that you give some thought to applying some different dimensional standards as the buildings get bigger, that we get them further apart, both side and rear. I think the front yard setbacks are fine. I think they're, at least in MDR, are like 25 feet. So I think that'll be fine to leave alone.
We can certainly look into that. I know internally we've bounced around some high-level LID thoughts on how we could get additional green space. Our Conservation Commission has been talking with us a lot about how we do some additional open space planning and whether or not we look at some sort of conservation subdivision in areas where there's sewer and water to try to preserve additional green space. So those are things that they're early on in the process right now, but I'm sure they will be continuing to do research, and they would come really well informed when they're ready to come to this body. But we will certainly keep that in mind. And then I don't know if it would make everyone feel a little bit more comfortable if we actually just kept the section number there and label it as reserved, so that we all know that there's a spot for it and it's coming back. I'd be happy to do that.
I think that's a really good idea. That way it won't leave the radar screen. So,
Yeah, I think that's a good idea also. I'm also just interested maybe to add on to Councilor Hatch's comments. Sometimes some exceptions to additional green space per development might be ways of consolidating that green space. So I'm pretty interested in the idea of cluster development. So moving buildings closer together, then allowing additional consolidated green space together. It also, something I've just been ruminating in my head on this topic is, is a way of quantifying how much green space we currently have and setting targets for preservation. So we decide how much green space we can lose to development over time and ways to do that intentionally, right? I think it's really important to increase density. That's a top goal of mine. But if we can do it in ways that don't tax our currently existing green space, I think that's really ideal. And there are lots of ways of doing that, but I think step one is to figure out what we have. Step two is to figure out how much we want to preserve, and then to come up with the right language that allows us to preserve it, either by increasing setbacks or clustering or, or requiring parks or other designated green space or undeveloped land to be part of your developments.
And to that point, I know for me, I agree with Councilor Hatch in the fact of some areas needing to look at possibly changing, like adding the 5 feet or something. I know down in Ward 6, we've got a new house that was just built behind the existing home on Winter Street. It's almost like a 1,700 square foot on this very small lot. So when you're looking at an area like that, the houses are already clustered, and there's little green space, there's little space between them. So if we're allowing additional units outside of a small standard ADU, putting in the multi-dwelling, you really got to look at the size of the lots and possibly change some of those to A, allow green space, and again, even just the clustering from neighbor to neighbor, that we could potentially have some issues.
Yeah, and I do just want to point out, I think that was an LD 2003 build. So there will be limitations for those structures that do not come under a subdivision or site plan review. And even if they do, there will be limitations if developers are using that state model to how much we can change setbacks. So for an LD 2003 build, they need to follow the single-family home provisions. So we could change where the single-family home goes on the lot, but it needs to be the same standard for every other home on the lot. So that was just something to be aware of. So if you change it if you want to go into the LD 2003 standards and change it so that all the homes have more setbacks, we would just have to change the dimensional standards. And we would probably want to be reporting back to council with an analysis on what structures may become non-conforming in what zones, because then you may be limiting someone's ability to increase or add additions to their home. So I just want to make sure that we will look into it, and we will certainly work with the city administrator to report back on the setbacks for the larger units. It was something that we would like to see as city staff as well. We often ask the question, can you put these units together on the property? But there is no mechanism to require that right now.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anyone else on that issue?
No, that's, nope.
Yes. Were you asking a question?
Nope, just,
Oh, I got stuff. I know if we're.
yeah, keep going.
I was just writing stuff.
So, again, I think I said last time, if I'm given the opportunity to stare at something long enough, I'll find other things. And I'm sure there's more out there. My problem is that I'm notorious for writing notes and then leaving them everywhere. It's been that way my whole life. I wish I was more organized. I'm not. So during the ZORS process, we had discussed, and Ms. Archer's, yeah, she's still presently here. We discussed during the ZORS process about Upper Main Street, and I don't remember where it went. I remember having pretty in-depth conversation about requiring site plan for any lot frontage on Main Street from roughly TA up to the overpass. Reason being was that we had found throughout years and years that we had missed opportunities to ensure that some of these properties that didn't trigger a site plan review, we could have had an opportunity to get them to, for example, do back access instead of having all these curb cuts. but I don't know what happened to that, and it's not in the ordinance. Like I said, I couldn't figure out where it went. I know there was discussion. It was something I was supportive of. It's something I'd like to see put forth. So I'm just curious from staff's perspective if you have any more history than I do on that, and if it's something we can add.
So I do vaguely remember that conversation. I think when I think I recall it being at the planning board level maybe, but there were a lot of meetings. So what I recall from that is we looked back and we did report, I believe, what structures on Main Street currently had a site plan review. A lot of them already had a site plan review, so we had and then if you didn't have a site plan review is triggered at 1,000 square feet of commercial development or redevelopment. So we have flagged it internally at the time as staff that we need to explain to people that they need to amend their site plans when they come forward with different projects. So that most of them were already under site plan, it was just a matter of getting site plan amendments. I know that there had been some changeovers in the past, so another thing that there was concern about, I think it was somewhat related to this, was facade changes. And so there was a standard at that time put into the ordinance that 25% of the exterior facing the street, if 25% of that changed, it would come back through for a review for an amendment of the exterior materials. And then the last one was that buildings over 35 feet in height were also supposed to come for site plan review. And in the downtown, we are looking for buildings to be built no shorter than 35 feet. So 35 feet is supposed to be the minimum, the way that it's written right now. So I guess this is my long way of saying there are many triggers for site plan review that I think ultimately captured what the board was looking for, or at least that was my recollection of the conversation. So we didn't necessarily call out a geography of where site plan review is always required, but we said as our operating procedures, we would require amendments to plans that had already had an approval on file.
Yeah, so, and again, I remember adding the 25%, and I think some of this conversation took place as you transitioned to wastewater. But I recall thinking, again, with other members, that regardless of those changes, the idea that, I mean, I've watched several recently. I mean, the Chase Bank, for example, did that go through a site plan amendment? Because they made...
I believe that did. I was at Water Resource again, but I believe it did, and that had a redevelopment plan. I can confirm that, but
Yeah.
I believe we were asked to review it as site plan.
And then, of course, you have the bank that just recently added. I guess, again, just from my perspective, there's been a lot of intent through councils going back 20-plus years of seeing things come to fruition, and we've missed those opportunities of saying, hey, okay, so you might not trigger site plan, but you're doing a significant change, or enough of a change that, hey, let's bring you in and see how we can change things that have clearly become an issue. So that's just my focus there. But if you think that, we're good, then I'm good with it. It was on one of my many notes to go back to. So, I mean, ultimately, I'm hoping to get this bypass road in the future, and being able to force these businesses to tie into it would be beneficial.
We just had a meeting about the bypass road. So Dave has an update here.
Chase did go through site plan. They actually made them close the drive-through that was behind the
Right.
Burger King. So
The connector.
So they did change the whole parking lot and everything else. So they did go for review.
Okay.
We were focused on the grease trap at the time down in Water Resource.
And if you can get a hamburger when you go make a deposit, we've got some problems, okay? So.
Sounds pretty good to me.
I mean, other notes of mine, master plan development standards, we, at least it appears from what I see, that we've removed the standards entirely, but yet there is note of master plan developments. Do we plan on moving forward with future plans for standards?
Yes, and I reached out to Mikey on Andor. He reached out to me, one or the other, but he did send me documentation. We plan to meet. We were hoping to meet at the end of last year, but we were just pretty busy in the planning department. So that is on the list to get a draft together that works for this year. I think there were a few things at the end that there was just not consensus on, and then maybe Bob left. So we just need to follow up on that. And I know Mike was working pretty hard on that draft.
Yeah, and my recollection is it was pretty well done, but to your point, I think there were just a few loose ends that needed to be wrapped up before we could vote and take a look at it. So I think you'll find that it's in pretty good shape. Now, that was several years ago, so times change, so we certainly need to look at it with a fresh set of eyes and in today's environment. But I think that'll be, it's a big project, but I think it'll be a little easier for all the legwork that was already done by Zor's committee, and Mike continue to move that forward with Bob. So hopefully that's what you find.
Yeah, and on that note, we are planning to host a visioning workshop with Long Range Planning Committee at their meeting in March. We have yet to determine that date, but we will, of course, share it when it's available. And that will look at the Portland Road sub-area plan that has been in the queue for a bit, and using the funding that is available through GPCOG and PACS from the Unified Planning Work Program to move that forward. And I would anticipate we would be talking about those standards in draft format around that time, or somewhat after that visioning workshop.
Is now an appropriate time to talk about the contract zone process?
I just have two other
Yeah, sure.
things that are just use related.
Great.
So, I had brought this up, one of the former planners, I think it was Jason. We have a use for farm stand and flea markets, and there's definitions. And I had questioned at the time whether or not, well, my personal opinion, it makes sense to allow farm stands in the downtown and the general business zone. And I would ask, if they're not, then how is it that we have a farmer's market that exists at Shaw's during the summertime? Because presently, like I said, they're not allowed in the zone. I would advocate for them being allowed in the zone along with flea markets. If these two zones are kind of your center or hub, why would you discourage, farmers that are in North Saco from coming down and selling your product instead of just on the side of the road? I understand why they defined them as such, but I mean, during this process, this Zor's process, I was speaking to Ms. Clavette at the time, saying, well, I myself had envisioned doing like a co-op farmer's market on my father's corner lot, but by ordinance, I wouldn't be able to do that, at least the way I interpret that. So unless there's, some kind of other objection to it, I think they should be allowed in the zone.
I think more so now than ever. I think there's been a recent movement to buy fresh, buy local. So, and we've got farmers in this community that's trying to make a living. I think that would be a very worthwhile pursuit, at least in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree.
Is because the Shaw's parking lot or the Saco Valley is essentially private property, is that how essentially there's no regulation, but they're allowed to do it? I mean, I've always kind of been curious about that. I just assume that since it's not a public parking lot, though, that's where they were able to set up there. Do we know?
I don't know how it's been allowed, but when I read the current definition of farm stand,
Yeah.
it seems as though that's a farm stand,
Yeah.
and it wouldn't be an allowed use today.
Yeah.
I don't think any of us see an issue with it.
Well, that's what, again, it's sort of like, because it's not on a road per se, it's in a parking lot. I think that's where there's the legal loophole, I suppose. And again, to everyone's point, I have no problem with it. And if we codify it, I think that would be great, though, because it would encourage probably, think of how much of that parking lot's usually empty. Even on a busy day, though, you could, really, cordon it off and make something out of it,
I think from our perspective that we missed it, we were talking about food trucks. I would consider it in the same alignment as a food truck. They're temporary, pop up, and then they go away. I think we just missed it when we were discussing food trucks, that we didn't really even consider. I mean, I don't remember any discussion on farm stands when we were talking about food trucks.
No,
I'm for it, so.
I think the key isn't to ask how was it allowed. I think the key
How do
is
we
to
make
make
it
sure
happen?
it is allowed going forward. But the food truck point is good. Do we need food trucks in these definitions also? Along with what we're discussing, fast food and eating and drinking establishments.
Yeah.
Farm stands, to me, are allowing them out in the RC where you can't have retail sales.
Okay.
So it's giving them a plus. You can always have retail sales in town and downtown, so there really isn't a problem if they call it a farm stand or a farm market. It's for people who can't have retail sales, it gives them a way to sell their product on their farm.
Okay, no, that makes sense, and I clearly, you're the one that has to enforce it. It was just when I read the definition, I don't recall a definition previously, but now when I read it, it makes it clear that if you're a commercial farmer, you fall under this, and I was just concerned that if, whether it was a farmer or, like I said, I myself want to do some kind of co-op, what would it fall under? But if you say it falls under retail, then I'm good with that. Yeah. Okay. Works for
Okay,
me.
any additional discussion on?
I mean, I have one last one. So, in the RC, pull this up. We, at some point, and I don't recall debating this change because I'm fairly certain I would have had a strong opinion, and I'm sure there's members of the public that would too. We apparently made place of public assembly a conditional use in the RC, where it was not allowed at all previously. Again, I would strongly propose that we go back to the old ordinance. We have we've had several requests via contract zones. I guess my overall problem with it is the definition is so incredibly vague, and you can manipulate it to do whatever you want, and that has, created problems or issues, whatever you want to define them. I much rather move forward with the current or the prior process, which is if you wanted it, you had to go contract zone. We've approved some, we've denied some based on the location, versus opening up the entirety of the RC to that use. And again, you pull up the definition, it's pretty significant. It really doesn't fit with the intent of the definition of the zone. I mean, you're talking about having event centers, and as I've stated previously, if you want to allow event center, let's define what an event center is and go from there and not have this vague definition that has been manipulated over many years. Allows food and drink. Well, what is that? That's another one of those vague. Are we allowing a restaurant? Because, again, anybody, as we've seen, anybody that hires a lawyer can figure out how to manipulate what's there.
Example was all you got to do is make it a nonprofit fundraising event and it becomes a public assembly.
Right.
That was discussed in the past.
So, like I said, I don't know how it got in there because I do not recall any at-length discussion during the process. It seems to have just become conditional, which again, I understand it's still not just outright permitted, but my personal feeling is considering, the strong reactions we get on that type of use. And again, I think it's always hard to see how that fits out in a very rural area, and then you look at the definition, it's like, oh, I can have a theater. Okay, well, that's, again, bringing a whole bunch of traffic out somewhere that, is rural by design, and the infrastructure is rural. So that's just my thought there.
I would support that in conjunction with hopefully our attempts to tighten up the contract zone process and make that a little bit more, build in a little bit more accountability. So I think that's a good idea.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I might be asking an ignorant question again. I'm having trouble following the conversation a little bit. That's not in our packet for today, right? Nor in the
No.
packet from 1/8. You're looking back at the original zoning ordinance?
Yes, this is just something I noticed this weekend.
Yeah, can you just to help me out, can you read me the definition of place of public assembly? Do you have it in front of you or no?
I don't have it in front
That's
of
all
me,
right,
but
I'll look it up
it's-
on my own.
I have it in front of me. A commercial, nonprofit, or government use that provides a place for public gatherings and events such as theaters, concert halls, auditoriums, function halls, clubs, and similar venues. A place of public assembly or entertainment may include facilities for the provision or sale of food and beverages to people attending activities or events, or the sale of related merchandise such as souvenirs, specialty apparel, or items related to the activities occurring at the site. And when I looked at this maybe 4 or 5 years ago,
Yeah.
all we had to do was make an event, a fundraiser, and all of a sudden you just changed it to fit this need. This conversation led to an amendment of a current contract zone of Riverwinds Farm. And that's how we kind of tightened it up by allowing some special events. Yeah, that's what led to that conversation. And this has been not clear since 4 or 5 years ago.
And so the desire being expressed now is a desire to either tighten up that definition
Yep.
or tighten up the way we apply that definition to the rural conservation zone?
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, my personal opinion, the way it's defined, I don't think it really has any place in that zone unless, again, we're going to look at it individually and lot through a contract zone as we have over the years. But to just have it there, I can definitely see where people will come forth and say, oh, I want to do this, and before you know it, you have a restaurant, really, for lack of a better term. You end up with a restaurant, we can just construct this so it's, weekends only, and then you have concerts. Again, the original definition dates back to, well, most of you probably won't remember, but Behind the Barn. That's where that came from. They had the big biker parties out off the Grant Road, and they needed to define it somehow, so they gave it that use. And that was, but over the years, it's like, well, we can't figure out how you fit, so we'll call it this. It's like, for me personally, if I was anybody living in any of those zones that you have a definition, it's like, wow, this can really be manipulated. And I think we're trying to move away from that. And
Were these discussions included? We had a contract zone not passed. It was for a wedding venue.
Yeah.
Out in Ward 2. I can't
Yeah,
remember the
Heath Road.
exact word. Yes.
there was one on the McKinney Road and so on and so forth.
Wouldn't it be easier just to tighten up the contract zone language rather than try to legislate, trying to prevent people from, again, taking advantage of something when we've already established they can legal up and basically try to get around it, though, when we already have the tool? And like to Council Archer's point, that we did, if people are paying attention and engaged, they can certainly vote down a contract zone, so people aren't just throwing up this, that, and the other. I mean, we already seem like we already have the tools, so long as we just, engage them, and to, I believe, one speaker's point, make it more actual consequences if they actually break the parameters of the contract zone.
Yeah, that's where I thought we were heading. I thought we were going to remove the conditional use completely off the chart and then rely exclusively on contract zoning. So I don't know if
so
that's consistent with what we're saying here.
Yeah, the use table allows for places of public assembly permitted, meaning you just go to planning and
Yeah.
ask for it in the downtown. Again, I don't have a problem with that.
But in the RC,
In the Portland Road, don't have a problem with that. And
Yeah.
then it's conditional in the RC.
yeah. So if we remove the conditional from the RC and rely exclusively on a beefed-up contract zone, we have a tool that can be used for a specific site with more control, I think, in terms of final. So that's where I thought this conversation was
that's-
heading.
Yeah.
I mean, that's where I lean towards sort of logically, but at the same time, I'm not completely sold on having to get rid of the conditional, because conditional, for that matter, is still conditional, and they still have to get approval, though. So, I mean, it's one of those things where if it's, they bring it forward and it's actually worth people's while, and, there's no complaints, then, I just don't want to see good potential uses precluded unnecessarily. That's why I was okay with the conditional, but that's why obviously not permitted, though. I mean, I think that would be a nice sort of if you, tighten the contract zone and keep conditional, I think it gives us plenty of tools, and we're not going to run into any bad situations, or at least ones where we don't have the tools to say, no, it's not a good idea, or the neighbors don't have tools to say as abutters, I don't think this, would work, though, and I think it might work out, though. That's why I didn't want to go all the way by just, saying not permitted, but again, I'm open to suggestions.
In my mind, this discussion would benefit from more specific language and a more
Sure.
thorough vetting. I think that the definition as written is too broad, as Councilor Archer pointed out, and probably doesn't belong in many parts of the rural conservation zone. I also have come to appreciate the complexity of contract zoning, and we also don't want a million different rules for a million different things. I think some of us have watched a video today explaining some of the complexities of contract zoning. And I worry about that process too, especially with enforcement mechanisms, the time that takes, and the individual negotiations that's involved there. If we could create a consistent set of guidelines about what we're looking for and under what conditions they may be acceptable, and be able to apply that more equitable to everybody, that may be better than one-off contract zones, if it's possible. And if not, then maybe contract zones are the appropriate tool.
So I appreciated that history, and I think what we should do is Dave and I will do a little tabletop analysis on whether or not anyone would be zoned out if the conditional use provision was removed, and we'll report back to you for the public hearing, if not before.
Just one question on that, how it applies to the city, because there has been discussions of possibly out on Route 5 having a place of public, a park or a theater out on Route 5 of city-owned land.
Doesn't apply.
That planning,
Doesn't apply.
it would be,
There's a definition in the ordinance that allows
The city to-
municipal use everywhere.
okay, I wasn't sure about that, thank you.
Ask if there's any other questions on anything else related to this so that we can be prepared moving forward.
Chapter 230 does go over contract zones. I believe Councilor Berman had questions. That falls under 230, so.
Yeah, so we have packaged those separately. I have a whole
Okay.
separate PowerPoint presentation. It looks quite similar, but
Should we move on to that?
Yep, is everybody set with previous discussion and ready to move on? Okay.
So as staff, we did package these separately, mostly because the housekeeping ordinance amendments had been a long time item that our assistant planner had been working on and had been taking feedback from staff over a year time period. And so we really tried to boil those down to make them not so policy-driven, but try to make them more clarity-driven. This, however, we packaged separately, even though it is, again, altering Chapter 230. So that seems a bit confusing, but that was why we packaged them separately, because we thought this item really was more of a policy item that required some additional eyes specifically on this one section. So just to recap, we did review these previously with City Council. We introduced the concept of changing this section at the December 18th Joint Planning Board and City Council meeting. Right now, we did not schedule, the council has not scheduled their public hearing on this item. The reasons for these requested revisions are to clarify the zoning amendment process, again, updates to contract zone provisions, and then we're looking to codify a list of Saco's contract zones, which is probably the most significant reason why I brought this forward for organizational purposes within our department. We have properties changing hands, and we want to make it as clear as possible what properties and where are subject to contract zoning provisions. Again, we offered the same crosswalk document in the same format. I won't really go through that, although on this document for these ordinance revisions, you'll see substantial is noted and checked off several times, meaning, again, they're more policy-driven discussion items that should have some greater eyes on them. And then at this point, I will note that we did receive written comments from Counselor Hatch from previous discussion with the council, so I appreciate that, Counselor Hatch. And then we are open to receive any feedback or comments. We did receive some very limited feedback from one of our long-range planning committee members that had to do with basically the process question that we heard about from Kelly Archer earlier, whether on page 54, C in that provision, whether it goes to City of Saco or to City Clerk or to Planning Board. So that was a good call out. We can certainly make that more clear. And the other note that we received was there's a provision under page, what is 4? Number 3 in parentheses. The question was, should but not limited to be stricken from that sentence? And we're looking into that. That may be a question that we just want to run through legal when we get to that point after we've incorporated feedback from this discussion. And again, we will incorporate any feedback, comments, and considerations from this evening into the next round that you'll see before you. So thank you.
I guess I'd like to weigh in on a couple of things. First, we've already had some discussion during the public comment about the proposed process of bringing contract zones to the city council for an initial review, or I guess initial feedback is the word. They're used interchangeably in the new language. I know some councilors have spoken in previous meetings about the utility of that, and to kind of give a general sense of the appetite for council of that contract zone or that planned use, so that the planning department and the applicant don't waste their time looking for a use that's ultimately not going to be acceptable. I believe at the time I spoke, and I've come to kind of strengthen my beliefs, that I have some concerns about that process. And in particular, I worry about the utility of an initial opinion when all the information isn't present. And I think that it's difficult for council to weigh in when we don't actually understand what the contract is going to look like or what the details will be. Often, the details are really important for these contract zones. I also received feedback, as I believe many of us had, from one of my constituents who pointed out that the difficult situation the planning board would be in denying a contract zone that council has already expressed a great deal of enthusiasm for, and that may limit the independence of the planning board review in either direction, really. And third, well, I believe that contract zones are a fundamentally political process, and that city council has to approve them or not. That there's actually a great deal of technical expertise that's required also, understanding the zoning, understanding the use, understanding the context in which that occurs. And I think that expertise and opinion, certainly at least for me, is invaluable in making my final decision. So I have some concerns about that proposed change, really fundamentally. And of course, as you point out, anything on going to the planning board is available for public review, and council, of course, can review and weigh in as citizens as they so choose to that process. And then I kind of have a second, more broad comment. We've had a couple of contract zones that have come before us a few times now in my term and a half on council, and that are the subject, the frequent subject of public feedback and concern. And one of the things I've been just reflecting on is the I don't know what you call it, the requirements that are put into contract zones. And some of them seem difficult to assess, difficult to enforce, perhaps difficult to comply with for the person holding the contract zone. And these are often very unique, sometimes about the number of cars that can go in, or the way you have to get things permitted, or the number of people that are allowed at certain times. And these both seem to create a disproportionate burden on the business or applicant, but also a disproportionate burden on the city to enforce, to follow up, and to assess. And sometimes in allowing these kind of one-off special exceptions, following these really narrow set of parameters, we've maybe taken what should be a win-win for the city and the applicant. They should be filling a unique niche that provides some public benefit, and instead we've created a burden for the applicant and the public and the city. And I just want to be really cautious as we think about that going forward. And I guess my third piece on contract zones I was thinking about is you've added some language asking for clarity about what the public benefit is, and I really applaud that. I think there needs to be a public benefit for the contract zone. But I want to maybe hear some opinions from council and from the planning staff. In my mind, the project should be the public benefit, right? If we need a place of assembly, they should be providing a place of assembly. If we need a wedding venue, they should be providing a wedding venue that the city needs. And I think sometimes that conversation has gotten lost in how many dollars are you paying the city, or what improvements are you making to abutting structures. And in my mind, putting a use that doesn't really fit in that location and doesn't provide a benefit in and of itself, but is going to build a turn lane or is going to provide a stoplight, that's not the kind of public benefit I'm looking for. I'm looking for the contract zone project itself to provide some benefit for the city, some benefit for the city's citizens. And so I don't know how to capture that discussion or how to really be thinking about it that way. But those are the three things I've been thinking about.
I was wondering, and using what would be called guiding principles, I mean, I think you could almost achieve two things here in terms of getting at this issue with creating these guiding principles that the council would have. And so if something came before you, you would certainly, you don't have to have the whole proposal in front of you, but do they achieve these certain guiding principles? If they do, it's like, okay, now we can go to the planning board. I think you really need to, you know, if you can create those guiding principles, and you mentioned a couple in your conversation, you would have a list and you would check off the list. And if the city council checks off the list and sees that it does achieve these guiding principles you want, then it would move forward. So, I mean, I would take a different tact. I think, Council, you mentioned political process. I would take a different tact and try to push it back to a policy-making process. And if you have guiding principles that you have for every single contract zone that comes before you, you come to the council first, but you have, in a broad sense, have to check off these before they go to the planning board. If they don't, if you can't check it off, then you really need to then send it back to whoever's proposing it and say, you know, these are our guiding principles. We don't, the city council, from a policy perspective, doesn't feel it fits in here. So before you even send it to the planning board, it would fit the policies that the city council supports, if you follow what I'm saying. And I've used guiding principles on a number of things, and it seems to help. It's the idea of getting the guidance principles in place and moving forward. So I think it would give more of a consistency to what you're trying to achieve.
In your past, Mr. City Administrator, have you used as guiding principles, have they been based on sort of like, I know in this city we've done the annual goal setting, or more sort of like a separate workshop or separate ordinance that we do on the side in terms of, you know, what we want for growth? I mean, how do you basically come to even decision of what those principles are?
Well, I think at first, I think you let the staff take a first shot at it. We're not reinventing the wheel here in terms of use of guiding principles. I used it, you know, just to give you an example on parking or parking structures or things of that sort. So you just try to let the staff do a little bit of research, just like we're doing right here. And you create certain, you bring it to the city council, and you list what you feel the guidance principles should be for contract zones. And if the council feels like they want to add or subtract, you have those. So once you put those into place, every time a proposal for a contract zone comes forward, you go back to these guiding principles and see if they achieve what you're trying to do as a council. If they don't, it goes back to the applicant. And then, so, and that way, you're not really you're not usurping the planning board's authority. You basically are using your authority as a policy body to say, oh, yeah, these check off a lot of these boxes, so yeah, let's get it to the planning board and let's see what happens, then it comes back to you. If it doesn't, if it's something that you feel doesn't achieve what you want as a community, because the community has to decide what it wants. I can't tell you what the community should have. I mean, the city council has to say it. And in many instances, you may want to have some stricter guidelines on how you move contract zones forward. So that's just a thought. I mean, I think it gives a lot of consistency to a process that doesn't have consistency.
These guidelines wouldn't be necessarily legally binding, because I can see a situation where
guidelines.
we have a discussion about something, and maybe there's like 5 issues, and we deadlock on 3, and then strongly agree on 2, though, but it may not, if it gets to the planning board and we actually have the planning people look at it and staff look at it, they actually might improve it. So it's not like we're self-imposing our own policy making, basically.
Right, and I think you can say, and then if the planning board understands what you're doing, if you're looking at it from the 10,000-foot level,
Yeah.
and they're coming down to the 1,000-foot level, at least they know what you're concerned about at the 10,000-foot level. So I think this would be a good way to accomplish what you're setting out to do, and that you set a policy, so it's really consistent. So, and then people that are trying to put in contract zones will have to look at the guiding principles and say, are these to be achieved, and how do I do that?
Certainly be less arbitrary than sort of like what we have now, for lack of a better term, which, I think makes everybody happy.
I would agree, but the problem I see with this, to begin with, is that contract zoning is arbitrary. It's not a right. It's not, in fact, we could go ahead and strike it from the ordinance altogether.
Right.
I would not have a problem proposing that. I think that what I've seen over really 30 years of my life is I just don't like the zoning, so I'll come forth and I'll get my way. Now, in theory, the idea of principles is great, but the problem we have is there's a new council every single year now. So what I think is good, a year from now, somebody else seated up here might not agree with me. So we're going to spin the wheels of what's our new policy.
No, well, hopefully,
Because
are you else?
No, go ahead.
Sure. So hopefully, there's some continuity. The way you've laid out your council elections now really sets up continuity. So, I would say that policies, and I've been working on it with city staff, talking about city council policies, starting to codify those as policy, 01-24, and you list what that policy is, and then if the next council comes in or new council members come in, they want to amend that policy, you go in and you amend it, and you footnote it that has been amended, 01-24 has been amended on such and such a date. And then a lot of councils, when they turn over all at once, which is problematic just in itself, usually will readopt policies, because policies aren't legally binding, at least to the next city council. But I would have to check on how, because now you have staggered terms, I suspect the policy is in place until the city council changes it. So again, you try to not codify, but you try to put in an orderly manner your policies, so that at some point, which, you might look at, you may go back and say, well, I'd like to go to the mayor and say, I'd like to talk about, policy 01-24, and it has certain provisions in it that you may want to amend. That's fine. That's the way it should be. But I think it's important to have some kind of guidance on when these contract zones come to the city council. That's just a thought, and maybe staff can look.
So I had brought this up at our last failed contract zone, which I don't remember what it was, because the way I looked at it is this council, the city, the staff, the applicant all put in significant resources for something that was going to be voted down anyway. So I came up and I discussed here kind of the concept of a pre-screen. That's all it is. It's just a pre-screen. I didn't use the words guiding principles, but that's kind of where my brain was going.
Right.
For example, we got to meet some key measurements, like is it unique? I think we can, at a pre-screen level, determine uniqueness or not, and a simple majority pushes it forward. But so much time was getting, because we had several contract zones all competing with each other at the same. I felt like they were coming all the time, and I think that's what led to this discussion is, We were spending significant resources. We do not collect enough revenue to go over the contract zone, so, and it takes away our council time from looking at other strategic initiatives. So that's why I had brought it forward, and I think there were other councilors at the time interested in this. It's not to usurp anybody's will. It's not to usurp a vote. It's just an initial, on its face, does it meet criteria for a contract zone? And that's all we're voting on. And if we say no, it just kicks it back. It kicks it back to the applicant to kind of take into those considerations, or the project is ended.
And that's how I conceptualized this many years ago, which is really, I wouldn't even call them an applicant because it's prior to them ever filing the application. They would meet with council in executive session. This is what we're thinking. Is there any appetite?
So this pre-screen happened in past practice.
And it had happened in the past,
And then all of a
once or
sudden,
twice, and then it
all
went away.
applications came to us.
And then we put this burden on the planning board to review them, knowing full well that it was kind of dead in the water, and it just seemed like a huge waste of staff time, their time, and money for an applicant.
It's just not practical to have the planning board be the first crack at this, though, just because, I mean, they have regularly five and a half hour meetings, and they only get through, two of the things, just because of all the things involved, to have something that, again, to your point, that is not even, possibly feasible. Why waste their time on it, though, when obviously there's applicants that actually have something that's vetted, something they've worked with staff, that sometimes have to stand at attention for 2, 3, even 4 meetings before they even get a hearing, while it's something where we as a council could weigh in and say, no, we don't want, an accordion factory next to the school or something ridiculous, but something that might be legally, possible. I think it gives us that tool, and, I mean, at the same time, I mean, of course, we're responsible to the voters, though, so, I mean, if voters thought that we were picking too many winners and losers to a level that, because I know Councilor Johnson's often made that point, that we are picking winners and losers, but if we cross the line where it's overtly political, I mean, it's not a hard burden to get us out of office, though, and certainly, obviously, the mayor has the ability to, appoint new members to the planning board, so I think there's enough fail-safes in here if we are the ones that have first crack at it, though, because invariably, we're elected officials. We're not going to try to push something through that the public's going to hate, because we would get fired for that in an election. So, I mean, I think that's just common sense.
So I want to give an example, because I feel like examples, especially when they're exaggerated, can show one perspective. I believe contract zone is $1,500 application fee, give or take?
I would have to verify that. It's around there, I
Yeah,
believe.
somewhere around $1,500. I could buy a property downtown, ask for a contract zone that we create a private transfer station downtown where I can just dump garbage. Are we going to make that go through the whole planning board process and then the council process? Just because I have a feeling I'll vote no on that one for sure. I use an exaggeration just to prove the process. We would be forced to do at least three meetings with the planning board, public hearings, and then we'd have to do that on the council side. Again, all for a final vote of no?
Yeah, I'd like to weigh in on this if I could, and then I'm going to ask Emily for some comments. I was part of the group that felt this preliminary, non-binding review was appropriate, and I'm still feeling like it is. And part of my motivation, large part of my motivation, was predicated on my own personal business experience. When you're in a bank as a commercial lender, you have people come in to borrow money, and all they have is sort of this conceptual overview of what they want to do and the amount of money they want to borrow and the structure of the loan that they're anticipating. And so you use that as a back-and-forth venting process, and in some case, a vetting process, rather. And in some cases, it creates constructive dialogue, and I many times would tell prospective borrowers that, I appreciate what you're asking for, but given the policy guidelines that I have within my institution, that loan is like going to be dead in the water. Now, you can file an application if you want, and you can put yourself and everybody else through all those hoops and hurdles, but having some indication up front of the likelihood of it being bankable is really, I think, an important piece. So that was my motivation for you, Emily, and the department and the planning board is knowing, as Joe has indicated, he and I have both been to, many of us have been to lots of planning board meetings. Your agendas are chock-a-block full of stuff, time-consuming stuff, and if there's a possibility that we could minimize that time constraint by vetting applications ahead of time, I always felt would be a benefit. So I want you to tell us what you think.
Thank you. So we brought this forward because in the last contract zone we did, I felt that there were questions that if we had had a vetting process, we as staff could have been more prepared to assist you as well as our contract zone petitioner or applicant. So that's why we recommended, and I was thinking it would work like a new business review where you can give feedback similar to how we do zoning ordinance amendment provisions. You can give feedback and then we can still send it on its way. If we don't want to send it on its way, if it doesn't meet a guiding principle, then we can certainly provide that information back to the applicant. You do already, to the city administrator's point, you do already have some guiding principles or recommendation guidelines that the planning board has to report back to you all, and you've seen those before. We could certainly build those out as a vetting tool for the council if you wanted to have a guiding principle policy that we could bring back for you separate from the ordinance if that is what you wanted. But certainly that was the reason why we brought it forward. We also don't want, it's very important to me that counselors do not feel surprised by someone requesting an application in their ward. You should be hearing it first if you're going to be the ultimate decision-making authority. So this was not, again, to take away any of the planning board's authority or review. It was to just offer you that first look and to provide that initial feedback to us.
Thank you. And correct me if I'm wrong, a fee would not be paid until that application was filed. So this preliminary review would not cost the applicant anything. Is that correct?
The way that we've been doing it is the applicant's been paying everything up front because that's our first review, that's our first procedural item. Everything gets logged a certain way, so everything has to be paid up front. We would deduct our staff time from the project deposit account, and then certainly if it was not successful, we would give the money back that was remaining in that project deposit account.
Thank you.
And Emily, I do believe that Biddeford follows this process of a pre-council application for any contract zone. So I'm not sure how their process is, but my understanding is I do believe that that is the way that they do it as well.
I wouldn't be surprised. I haven't sat through one of theirs, but.
But I don't want to disregard public comment. You know, we heard about the politicizing of these kinds of decisions, and I respect the fact that if we had guiding principles, that could be a point of demarcation, but I also recognize that the culture and fabric and skill set of the council evolves and revolves, and so we could have 7 sitting members, which I trust we all are, very high integrity. We're gonna do what's right, and then somebody else comes in and maybe doesn't hold themselves up to that same standard. So I understand the risk of politicizing an application. I think we can take some steps to mitigate that risk, but the fact that you have these guiding principles that could be changed with a subsequent council puts a little bit of a dent in that. But I'm not discounting the value of what you've described, John. So I think if we're going to move forward with this, I like the guiding principle process that he's described.
We could also look at it, we could vote on measurements. For example, we all vote, does this have a public benefit? And it's yes or no. And like very clean, not too much discussion on them. Does it just meet the standard? Just like the planning board does. If we agree it meets the standard, then it goes to the process. If it doesn't meet the standard, that would be on staff to inform the petitioner.
Yeah, I think guiding principles would be absolutely essential to keeping this as a policy discussion and not a political discussion. I also would just caution that we might want to use the words, does this have the potential to have a public benefit? Does this have the potential to? Because we probably won't have the full application in front of us, right? So it's really that initial review. Do we think it has the potential to be successful once it's gone through the full review? Might be language I'd be even more comfortable with. You know, policy document, these are the 4, 5, 6, 7 things we're looking for. Do we think it's likely to meet these benchmarks once it's gone through the full process?
I think it would be also very beneficial for the city to have one form that we use. I know this is more of a procedural administrative thing, but certainly we can work on that. Like, this is the form that every contract zone is supposed to have, because every contract zone is written a little bit differently in the city. So that would be very helpful if we're going to be doing.
I've discussed, I'm trying to remember what I can and cannot say, because a lot of these discussions are in executive session, but conceptually, I would love to have certain sections that are always added, even if it doesn't apply, maybe there's a section, but we don't really put enforcement into any of these contract zones. If you, the ones I've seen, I don't remember ever seeing enforcement, ever. And if you're going to hold someone accountable, if you've said this is what we're going to do, you're actually you're taking the politics out of it, because you're just saying, I'm holding you to the standard.
And I think that's critical, because right now it seems to me that often the only enforcement mechanism would be canceling the contract zone, which is something we're often unwilling and not going to do in reality.
And we don't put punitive measures in,
And
you
so,
can put those in.
Having other enforcement mechanisms, you know, financial ones or otherwise, I think would be important to give the city a tool to enforce the contract zone without having to shut down some use that we thought was of great public benefit, at least at some point.
Always found it a little more beneficial if you ask the person filing or the person that's going to be in charge of the premises to present you with their compliance monitoring plan. And that's why we added that in number 8, so that we would actually ask, along with a contract zone application, please present to us what your compliance monitoring plan is. And that is something council can work with the applicant through the process to amend. And then that will get to the heart of I hope that would get to some of the heart of the discussions that counselors brought up tonight, which is enforcement of some of the provisions, and that Counselor Berman brought up, meaning some of the provisions that code or planning have to look at, and how easy or difficult those would be, whether they fit in a current compliance monitoring program. And I think that would kind of bring transparency to the compliance monitoring piece of it.
And also, I'd like to add, for any violations that are proven to be violations, that we add in a certain staff dollar to that for how many hours that we're because that's above and beyond. If we make a contract and I do exactly what I say, there's no additional cost to the city. The benefit comes, but if all of a sudden we're spending 40 hours trying to keep them in compliance, from a enforcement perspective, not from the initial contract, but enforcement, we should be recuperating additional costs that they are providing to the city.
And I think there'd be some benefit when the contract comes to council of staff presenting their compliance monitoring plan, right? How, can we monitor this? What would be involved from a city and staff perspective in monitoring it, and what would enforcement look like? Because again, I feel like there's requirements written into contract zones that are very difficult to enforce, and I can't imagine a real enforcement or monitoring plan was really conceptualized when those contract zones went through.
I'd love to see your monitoring tool or mechanism prior to the contract being signed. Like, this is the monitoring that we, as two parties, agreed to. That way, we're not changing it on the dime and stuff like that, or not getting what we anticipated, or one of our constituents stated a little less professional than that person would like.
Is there any concern that if the council gives a nod to a project moving forward in a contract zone, that we'll be held to it because the person will continue to invest? Should we make sure our lawyers have something in the form that makes that very clear that we have not endorsed it? Also, my other comment is I agree with Councilor Johnson. As a landholder, we already have a code, our codes in place for zoning and a comprehensive plan. So if we continue to allow these contract zones, what's the long-term effect on our traffic flow, our utilities, the internet use? Just something to consider.
There's your guidance right there, though, that we can, if we have guiding documents in terms of how we consider contracts, we can actually bring some meat to the comprehensive plan, though, because I always complain that the comprehensive plan sometimes is just a piece of paper that, the contract zones can or even our own zoning can override, but if we apply those standards to what we would have to do as to vet contract zones, I think would actually give meat to the document that's forced upon us by the state. That's just my opinion, but nevertheless, it would actually make the document a lot more meaningful and living documents, such as our zoning laws are.
It's also, I wanted the language likely to meet these standards. That way, if they fail to in the final application, we haven't already found that they met them. We just thought there was the potential to meet them in the future that may fall flat once we see the final application.
Thank you, Councilor Hewitt, for those comments. We will make sure that there's legal review, and we will also respond on long-term effects of contract zones. Every contract zone does go through a site plan review process as well, so some additional vetting happens after the contract zone process, but good questions.
Well, I'm sorry.
I think that's a very important point by the planner, because oftentimes I've witnessed council going, oh, it sounds great, not understanding that this has to go through a site review or site plan process, and oftentimes I've seen projects being delivered to a planning board that's like, well, now what do we do? And so it's the opposite, right? Now they're stuck trying to figure out how to make a project work because council approved something, because council didn't have an understanding of what those impacts actually would be. They just thought it sounded good. And that's always been something I've struggled with. Every time we've had a contract zone, I try to think about how a planner or the planner and the planning board is going to look at this at site plan, because then they're going to get additional conditions placed on them that might actually conflict with, what we've put for conditions. And again, I just go back to the first word in the first sentence of contract zone in the ordinance. It says occasionally. We've got over 50 in less than 50 years. So that's, we're on pace for more than one a year, which that's not occasionally. All you do is look at your surrounding communities.
So do we change the language to be more stricter? Because that's where I would go. I would rather not get rid of,
I think it should
a
be.
contract zone is a tool that can be used beneficially when it's used correctly.
Correct.
However, so I don't want to get rid of it.
You're thinking it
But
can't-
do we make it an exception? Do we change the terminology to make it more prohibitive to allow it?
I think, you know where I stand with that. You look at the way this is written, it's so incredibly vague, it's so subjective to whoever is setting up here.
So we should just relook at this whole thing. The
Versus,
language.
what the original intent was. And the original intent was extreme special circumstances.
Yes.
That's going to really benefit a community, not just, oh, well, I don't fit the height or spatial requirements, give me a contract zone. And, or I don't meet the parking requirement, give me a contract zone. And that's certainly what has happened since 2000 on.
We're also aware of people that use contract zone to bypass zoning.
Right.
A lot of people buy property and know, oh, well, it doesn't fit the zone, I'll go to contract zone, or who's going to deny me?
But that's where the public benefit becomes really critical. There should be an extreme public benefit.
Yep.
And that's where our guiding principles can also become very beneficial, right? Our guiding principles for this new pre-review we might do can set the standards pretty high for the public benefit, for the and for the compliance with the zone and for the uniqueness of the situation.
And it's gray, because it happened so many years ago, but that wedding venue on Heath Road, some of the counts, I remember I was talking about, one, there was like a noise ordinance, so it was actually a detriment to the area, because I even went there and listened how loud it was, because they told us the decibel level. So I just blared up my radio and walked across the street onto someone's yard, and I could hear it. So I used that as it, and again, it wasn't that exceptional. It was just, it was going to be a barn, I believe.
Was that the one that we had emergency vehicle spacing issues about a turnaround?
Yeah, and they had to figure that out as well, yes.
Yeah, we
So-
couldn't get the emergency vehicles down if we needed to.
Yeah.
Or a hammerhead at the
And
base.
that was denied, but I denied, I can't say why it was denied, but I denied it based on a couple measurements that it just did not meet the standard. And so I think we just need strict standards.
I think that, I met with Emily and John today about this issue, and I think we all agreed, and I think we're getting the consensus here, that the language in the contract zone that specifies situations in which this is appropriate can certainly be improved upon, and I think that Emily's perfectly capable of working with John and others to come up with some language to just strengthen it and limit its use, because I would agree, these should be truly limited situations with a public benefit. I just wanted to make a comment about contract compliance, because a part of my professional life, I live this. When you enter into a contract, it's an agreement between two parties. So in this case, it's the city giving up something for a benefit, and the party receiving the contract is benefiting as well. And there's an implied expectation that both parties will meet all the conditions that they agreed to in that document. So I get a little queasy when I hear that, if we don't comply and we make every effort to gain compliance and we just have a party who won't comply, the revoking of that contract, you're in default. So I think our default language within our contracts should be a lot more clear, a lot more forceful. And personally, I would give everybody the benefit of the doubt, but if you just cannot get the party to comply to what they agreed to, then we should have the ability in a severe default situation to cancel that contract. And the property should revert back to what it was before the contract was executed. So I would not be bashful about expecting all parties to comply, and I would hope that we could have some fairly, not only standards of default, but remedies for default, which are very common in these kinds of documents. The other issue that I think needs to be clarified is that having to do with either the termination of the contract if the contracted use ceases, or the extension, the formal extension of the effective dates of the contract when the property exchanges hands, because that contract went to the property owner, and in order for that new property owner to come in and assume those same rights and privileges, and I'll leave this up to our legal counsel, but it's been my experience that you have an amendment to the contract that substitutes one party for the other, and it gives the city of Saco an opportunity to revisit the contract itself and maybe even modify some of the requirements in that original contract. So I think that is another area that would be well served to have some attention. And this is legal stuff, so we're going to really need some help, I think, with counsel to help us work our way through that. So, and when you have a contract violation and both parties are willing to acknowledge that, we as a city should have a waiver document that gets signed by both parties saying, hey, listen, we'll waive the adherence to that contract provision this time, but if you do it again next time, we're going to reserve the right to enforce the contract. So I think that's an area that I would hope we could see some improvement and remedies for.
So I think in your response about transferring of the property, I think that's an individualistic look at it that needs to be in the contract and language there. Because if you turn a house somewhere in here, we turn it into a kitchen, right? And then it's allowed. Let's say we make it allowed, it's a restaurant, but it's an old house. We decided, hey, this looks cool, it meets our standards. They sell. Does it automatically revert back to a house? I would argue in that case, probably not.
Well, I think that's a bone of contention that Emily can
That's
address.
the individualistic aspect of a
Yeah.
contract, I think we
But
still
if
need.
the new party is going to use the property for the exact same purpose as the person who's selling,
Then that's fine.
that's fine.
Yeah.
But let's have a moment of reckoning, if you will, and make sure that everybody's on the same page. But I know that Emily's got a comment she wants to share.
Yeah, so it does depend, this goes back to my earlier comment about having one standard form, and it sounds like Counselor Archer's comment years ago. So it does depend on the language that we've stumbled across this a few times, of the contract zone, whether or not it is transferable or non-transferable. Those with transferable clauses can come to the city council and request that they be transferred. And those with non-transferable, there's still a question, it's somewhat ambiguous because there's still a rezoning that happened to the property under state statute authority. So the other thing that I just want to bring up too is in Maine, and Dave might want to bring it up too here or have comment about it, but in Maine, the variance requirements are much different than in other states. So that's why contract zoning becomes interesting to people, because in other states you may be able to go for a variance to a setback, but in Maine, the hardship variance is very hard to get. You have to prove 4 standards, and most people cannot prove those easily. So that's why contract zoning has been an avenue that's been of interest to people. So just to keep that in mind as we move forward with these changes, we want to make sure the language is strict enough. We certainly do not want to be advocating for contract zones, but we also just have to keep in the back of our minds, you may see, like if somebody comes to me and says, well, I want a contract zone on a property, I say, well, really you should try to get a zoning map amendment or a zoning amendment for the provision that you want in the area that you want, rather than going for a contract zone, unless there is, as we've been talking about, an extreme or special circumstance where there would be a contract zone on that property. So if it's okay, if I could just recap where we are right now, I'm hearing that we will want to bring forward draft guiding principles and report back, working through city administration on that. We will look at the current requirements as we make those and the comp plan. When I say current requirements, I'm referring to the planning board requirements for recommendation. We'll look at a standard contract zone form when we come back with those draft guiding principles. We'll definitely look at the introduction under 1705, where it says occasionally, and look at more strict language as to special and rare circumstances or something to that effect. I'll go back and listen to this discussion and try to capture what we have discussed regarding enforcement, but definitely having a compliance plan with a compliance monitoring program attached to the contract zone will be really important, and one that gets vetted with staff as well. I am hearing that we will keep the existing recommendation to at least have initial feedback from city staff, from city council. And we will certainly update these revisions and then send them for a legal review so we can have that packaged for you when we come back. I will clarify the city under C, we've received 2 public comments on that. I will clarify that where in the city of Saco it will go to. What we're trying to do is standardize all practices regarding zoning amendments and requests for contract zoning. The zoning amendment provision had it going to city clerk, and getting logged there. So we'll just kind of clarify that and make sure it's clear and follows a similar process for both types of reviews. The one thing I did want to point out, if I can, at this point, is in section I. Dave Toomey and I both looked at this. Other permits, we would not, as staff, want an applicant that's going to need a contract zone to start getting other permits before they get a contract zone. I think legally that puts us in a question mark, and also is probably not best practice. And then the contract zoning list, we have, as city staff, gone through those. Some people do not own these properties anymore, so there'll be a more thorough vetting of this list. But again, I know, again, if there's any others that you see on here, certainly going forward, we plan to keep a better list. That's part of codifying this of contract zones that are dissolved.
So you're going to redline item I in the future? You're going to just Redline it? Item I?
Redline it?
Yeah, the other permits. Delete it.
Oh, yeah, under I,
Yeah.
we have it shown just like how it is right there.
Sorry, I'm looking at E-code. I went straight.
Yeah.
Oh,
the-
yes,
I went
yes.
straight to the source.
The 1/824 packet shows it
Gotcha.
crossed out.
Thank you. All right.
And if I could add one more item, and it seems minimal, but it's an issue that I'm bringing forth with contract zones, but I think it's an issue that needs to filter its way through the remaining aspects of the ordinance where it's appropriate. And that is, as we all know, spread out throughout the ordinance, there are performance standards that talk about impacts on municipal services. And item, I think it's 6 or 7 in the current ordinance talks about that relative to contract zones. I would really like to encourage us to consider modifying that by including some reference to public school system impacts. That has just been, it's not clear, and sometimes I see us pay attention to it, and sometimes we don't. And I think that for the long-term benefit of our taxpayers and the growth of our city, I think that somehow we have to figure out how to include impacts relative to school system in our overview of municipal services. Thank you.
Okay. Any other comments or questions for Emily?
I just have one
Yep.
question, if I can just go back to the housekeeping ordinance amendments quickly. I just would like to do a quick recap so that I know what we're bringing back, if that's appropriate, Madam Mayor. The first one I have is we're increasing the mailing distances from 200 and 600 feet to 400 and 800 feet. What we'll do is we'll bump up that 200 to 400 and 600 to 800 in the zones they are now. So we'll keep the smaller areas where they are and for distances, if that makes sense. Right. Okay. For food uses, we will dive further into that and report back based on this conversation, so thank you for your input. For urban green space, we will leave the header as reserved, so we will just strike the wording, but it will be reserved to show it that it has a space and it's coming back. For setbacks for multifamilies, we will look into that and report back as well. We will review, confirm farm stands and food trucks and report back. We'll review the RC zone for places of public assembly, and then do a little tabletop analysis among staff and just see if anything would be zoned out if the C was taken out of there. That is what I had on my list, so just want to make sure that it matches.
Does that cover everything for everyone?
I just wanted to, Counselor Berman, and at some point, this isn't going to be part of what we're going to do now, but I think you made comment relative to the green space and try to determine how much green space we have now. And I would say you'd probably want to look at by various parts of the city and by zones. So
We're working on that now with our Conservation Commission. We have mapped for lack of a better term, protected spaces in the city. So the Conservation Commission saw a first draft of that plan, and we're trying to get that percentage down as to both the land trust and those protected spaces. Would we want to expand that to green space? We were thinking green space held by protected areas, but we could certainly include an HOA level green space review as well.
Well, I appreciate that, and I'm aware of those efforts, and I think they're great. I mean, I guess the nature, in my mind, our discussion around urban green space was highlighting the benefits of some open space even in urban areas, and there was some discussion about how to preserve and protect that. And in my mind, it's hard to preserve and protect if we don't know what we currently have and we don't know what we're targeting. So the current efforts to map our preserved and non-developable space is, I think, really important. But I think this might be in addition to that and expand those efforts to understand currently, I don't know the right metric, but perhaps it's percent paved or percent developed or something along those lines. and then understand how various different development plans might affect that going forward. For example, with cluster development, you may be able to increase density while also increasing unpaved space, or at least preserving what we have. And they may or may not do it better than changing setbacks. I'm just not certain. But that's the kind of thinking that I'm trying to engage in.
Thank you, both city administrator and counselor.
And when we discuss green space and all that, are we considering what's considered buildable land? Is that considered, or are we just, when we formulate what we're looking at, or is it undevelopable land, which has different reasons? Like, conserving land is valuable, but not if it's not usable as well. Green spaces become
Yeah.
public parks, green spaces can become other things. So the usable land considered to not usable land could be helpful.
Yeah, I think both are really useful.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to keep track of what is buildable and not built upon, and to consider that also.
And not then use that as your reason, so why we have all this marsh space available, that's, to me, yes, it's green and you're conserving that land, but it's going to be conserved by default.
Yeah.
Not in targeted action by the city.
And maybe that's okay, and maybe it's not, but it's hard for us to make policy decisions around that until we know what it is.
Yeah.
And without knowing what it is, it's hard for us to gauge whether that's enough. And there's conservation for ecological reasons, there's conservation for recreational reasons, there's conservation for, aesthetic reasons.
And that's what I mean, I don't know what
And those
green
may be
space
in different
means.
places, yeah.
I would consider Foss Road green space, because it's now the soccer field and all that, but others may not.
I think we've hit on some of the problems with the current section, so
Yeah.
let us report back and thank you.
And I would be remiss, I probably should have done this at the beginning. Emily, you and the staff and the planning board and everybody, John, I mean, this is yeoman's work. And I love the crosswalk document. I was able to follow it through directly to the ordinance itself today as I was reviewing this. This is a boatload of work, and so I appreciate that. These are these housekeeping things. We all knew they were there. We needed to vet them and fix them, and so kudos to you. And I know there's more work to be done, but this is a great step in that direction. So thank you for that effort.
Thanks, and I'll definitely pass that along to our team.
And again, my opinion only, but this was one of the reasons why I'm glad we're seeing this so quick with the new compliance officer coming on board, because this was what I was envisioning. So it's moving forward the way I was hoping.
Okay, anything else from anybody? Got everything? All right, thank you both. And next on the item agenda, we do have administrative update. City Administrator Banco?
I really don't have a lot, other than to thank the fire, police, all those that were in the school department, all those that were involved with Friday's response. I've gotten nothing but good feedback about that. I happened to be at Thornton Academy taking a tour when it happened, but it was interesting to see how well they responded too. I was quite impressed with their response and how they deal with it. So other than that, I don't have anything.
Great, thank you. Council discussion and comment. Councilor Berman.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Mayor. I'll echo City Administrator Bohenko's comments about the police and fire response to the situation on Friday. My daughter at Thornton Academy was caught in the middle. I was getting updates by text, and just appreciate everybody keeping them safe. It was a difficult and traumatic experience. I would also like to add on a different item. I received some emails today, I think the whole council did, about a court case in front of the Maine Judicial Supreme Court last week involving a contract zone. I was surprised to find the city of Saco was involved in a case in front of the Maine Supreme Judicial Court last week. As I've mentioned to the city administrator, who seemed equally surprised, I just want to say, regardless of the merits of the case, and I understand the city's need to defend the actions of this council and the planning board, I don't like being surprised in that way. And so I'd appreciate it, and I've already spoken to the city administrator to get regular updates about litigation the city's involved in, what course cases we have pending, where we are in them, and what the city's legal stance is. I think it's useful for us as council to be aware of that and to be able to address questions coming from the public about it. So I appreciate your prompt response to me today. I appreciate you looking into it. I appreciate everything in the way you've handled that. And I hope for additional communication around that going
Yeah,
forward.
And I agree with you, and I, certainly understand that something of that nature should be before the city council in terms of knowledge of a case. I already have, and I wrote some notes, and I have some ideas how I'll deal with it.
Anyone else?
Given the situation that happened on Friday, does anyone else think there should be possibly more video surveillance in the city? That'd be useful to our police department?
Well, I think the important thing, well, I think first of all, we'd have to check statutes and how we'd be able to do that. So I can certainly talk to the chief, but I think there might be some state statutes out there relative to how you use and how you collect that data. So I'll talk to the chief about it.
Councilor Archer?
Yes, thank you, Madam Mayor. I just want to piggyback off of our city administrator. Of course, thanks to all, but I want to go one step higher, is that Friday's events, I truly saw systemic congruence. Every department did what they needed to do. A private school entity did the right thing. The city did the right thing. Our city administrator updated the council in within an hour, what I consider a right on target. You have to be able to assess what's going on and then communicate it. So we got that information. You kept us updated, and our school department, our buses, we sending police to the schools to allow the kids to get on. Everything was done with systemic congruence, and it's something that when we assess, when the city, everybody assesses what happened and what's going on and what went well. I definitely want us to recognize that everybody communicated the way I thought they should. I've been in stressful situations, life-threatening situations before, and if they aren't done in the manner in which it was conducted, it can be a lot different circumstances. So everything from the mayor communicating with us, doing what she needed to do, it was done the way I thought an emergency response should be done. And I wanted to not just say thank you, but congratulate everybody for doing what they needed, from communications to public works to everybody who stepped up in this unfortunate incident. As you know, maybe about 2 or 3 sessions ago, I said, what is council's role in an emergency? Maybe I should have knocked on wood, because I didn't do that, and then within weeks, we had an emergency at this nature. But I just thought it was public that, again, this was systemic congruence. Everybody did what they needed to do, and from my perspective, it worked out very well. Police, fire, everybody. So just wanted that to be publicly known, not just a thank you, but a congratulatory statement. Thank you.
Councilor Gunn?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. To Councilor Hewitt's point, though, I know that we've had some discussions, well, there were some sessions at the state level in the last several years about use of surveillance cameras, and obviously Civil Liberties Union versus need to police, obviously, in the 20, 25 years since the terrorist attack. So it's become a really valuable tool, and if it's used properly, it can really give us that extra level of security, though, and I'm definitely, in terms of public places, if it's something that can be applied to City Saco, if it's something that's practical, I'm definitely open to the conversation, because I think it would be, it would definitely help people's peace of mind. But on that topic, I'd like to piggyback on Councilor Archer. To the people of Saco, you saw your city work extremely well on Friday afternoon, and I think that the people of Saco need to take away from that is that not to let bad actors like this terrorize you and unnerve you. This is a horrible thing, and it could have been a lot worse, but the fact is everyone did what they're supposed to do, and our police and their partners are continuing to do what they're supposed to do to get the perpetrators of this, and that you should not feel unsafe. This city is well served, it's well protected. We have a top police department, top fire department, everyone, staff on down, did what they're supposed to, and just, this is a horrible thing, but do not let yourself get unnerved about this. Your community is a safe community, and the fact that we got through this and we're resilient about this, don't let things like this, put you off, though, because this is a safe place to live, and I'd stand by that.
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay, moving on to adjournment. Is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved?
Motion by Counselor Hatch, is there a second?
Second?
Second by Counselor Gunn. Roll call vote. Counselor Archer.
Aye.
Counselor Parks.
Yes.
Counselor Gunn.
Sure.
Counselor Berman.
Yes.
Counselor Hatch.
Yes.
Counselor Hewitt.
Yes.
And Counselor Johnston.
Yes.
Motion passes 7-0. Adjournment at 8:42. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Mayor.